Just very briefly, the book argues that all our lives are very bad and generally much worse than we think. So we are systematically and significantly mistaken about their value. We shouldn't have children. Women should have early abortions. The abortion debate on the whole is between the pro-life and the pro-choice lobbies. The professor holds a candle for the pro-death view. He thinks that any woman needs excellent reasons not to abort her child. He hopes that one day all humans and all other animals will be extinct.
Well, as the name suggests, it's the view that we ought not to bring new beings into existence, more specifically more sentient beings. And I suppose the most controversial instance of that would be new human beings.
Mm-hmm. And so the view is that it's better to not bring... I mean, so how would you say it's just preferable to not bring new life in, or is it like there's a strong obligation that it's always morally wrong? Are there any circumstances which you'd say that it was right?
I think it's in practice always morally wrong. In the book in which I outlined these views, Better Never to Have Been, I did consider the possibility of phased extinction,
mm-hmm.
and then looked at that from the perspective of different theories to see whether they would allow it or not, given the earlier arguments. And I did suggest that some of those theories might allow a phased extinction, and that would mean some limited reproduction in order to phase out humanity. But in practice, I don't think that any reproduction is justified, because you're not going to have the situation in which everybody's collectively deciding not to reproduce. I think that asymmetry argument that I've presented so far shows that coming into existence is always a harm. But that is not enough, I think, to show that.
So now I'm going to do another thought experiment, very similar to the last one. This time, it's once again a completely empty universe, a universe devoid of any life, any conscious life. And so there's no consciousness, nothing, no experience. This time, you come to exist. A brain comes to exist and starts doing consciousness. So there's subjective conscious experience, and this brain just happens to be you. And that you have to, once again, look at yourself as just a brain that's doing consciousness. So you could look at this brain objectively and kind of forget that it's you, and just look at it as a brain that's doing consciousness. And so that brain is what's responsible for the imposition of conscious experience. That's a term that anti-natalists use, is the imposition of consciousness. It means that consciousness is, we're kind of hurled into this existence without our consent. It's imposed on us. And so here it is, you don't exist, there's no experience, and then suddenly experience begins due to the existence of a brain. A brain comes to exist, and then bam, there's experience. It doesn't matter that this brain is you or not, it's just the fact that there is a brain that starts to do conscious experience, and so experience is imposed. And now, let's rewind back to the beginning of this thought experiment. Only this time, a completely different brain comes to exist. And so, once again, consciousness is imposed. But it's via a completely different brain that is imposing this consciousness. You see, because you didn't exist before this consciousness started. So there is no actual you that this consciousness is being imposed for. It's just a matter of a brain being responsible for starting a consciousness. And so in the first scenario, a brain came to exist and started doing consciousness. And in the second scenario, a brain came to exist and started doing consciousness. And so in the very same way that in scenario one, a brain coming to exist and starting doing consciousness imposed consciousness onto you, the same thing is true for the second one. Only it's, we all call ourselves you. We all refer to ourselves as I, and we all call each other you. So it's a different I. It's a different you this time. In a kind of general, objective way. The same way that I am I, and you refer to yourself as I. So there's this sense of self, this subjective experience. Subjectivity is a product of the brain. So there's subjectivity that exists via the first brain, which is you. Then there's subjectivity that exists via the second brain. And if you weren't born the first time, if that brain never came to exist, then there would still be the sense of being a self. It would just be a different self. If you weren't born, then instead of this life, it would have been the other life that did come to exist, as opposed to nothingness, or a deprivation of experience, or a state of neutrality, as David Benatar and Alex O'Connor suggested. That they suggest that if you don't exist, that there's this state of neutrality. So I'm saying that instead of that state of neutrality, that would be canceled out by the mere existence of a brain doing consciousness. So consciousness is imposed either way, despite no matter which brain is the one responsible for imposing consciousness. It's inescapable, because there's no you to escape it. There's no you to be spared from this consciousness. It's just, that's the only experience there is. There is no state of neutrality. That would be an experience. There is experience being done by a brain, and so that is the experience. Just as, if you were the only one that existed in the universe, then that is the experience. But if this other brain is the only one that exists in the universe, then that is the experience. So I will go ahead and start the thought experiment now. So imagine that there are only two conscious or sentient organisms in the entire universe, and they just happen to be here on Earth. And so this first one here is a human that happens to be in an art gallery, and he is or she is looking at this art. This individual is just standing here looking at this art. And the other organism that happens to exist is, we'll say it is a bird that is looking up at this tree for some reason. And so these are the only two experiences or consciousnesses that are in the universe at all. That's it. Nowhere else, anywhere else. For the purposes of this thought experiment, there are no other consciousnesses anywhere else on Earth or anywhere in the universe. So that's it. There's just these two. And then one of them dies. So let's say that the one on the human on the right side here on the screen dies. And so the only conscious experience that exists now is that of the bird. That's the only conscious experience that is occurring after the other one has died. And as you can see, the other one didn't go and see a black void or anything like that. No, the only experience that is occurring after the other consciousness has ended is the consciousness or the experience of this bird, what the bird is witnessing. So here's the thought experiment on death, generic subjective continuity. So imagine you're here at Arches National Park and you're standing there looking at the arch, and well, then suddenly everyone dies. Everyone in the universe dies, including you. There are no more consciousnesses whatsoever anywhere. And so a lot of people imagine that after you die, it'll be all black. You'll just see this empty black void. There will be no sound or anything, no thoughts or anything like that. And this is actually nonsensical, because what would happen, well, let's see what would actually happen if generic subjective continuity is true, and if you actually did cease to exist. So here we are again. You didn't die yet, but let's imagine that you do die. But then after you die, let's say some period of time after you die, that some other single living organism, a sentient organism, comes to exist somewhere in the universe. So instead of it being a black void after you die, what it would be is, well, let's see. So you die, you cease to exist, and then instead of it being a black void, it is something more akin to a camera switch on a movie set, because there are no other perspectives anywhere else in the universe except for this one. So this is the only experience that is occurring now. Instead of you in a black void or you being anywhere, you're completely gone. So the only experience that is occurring after you've ceased to exist is the one and only experience that does exist. It is the only experience there is. And so it is, like I said, it's this experience of this organism that came to exist after you died, rather than it being you in a black void, because you're completely gone. So the only experience that is going on is the experience here on this other planet, who knows where it's at, billions of light years away, or maybe even in another parallel universe somewhere. But so that's what would be going on, as opposed to being in a black void. So if you died, you're here, you're alive, and everyone dies, including you, it would not be a black void. Instead, if you died and then someone else eventually came to exist somewhere else in the universe, because that would be the only experience there is occurring at that point in time after you've died, it would be that consciousness, that experience of being a living organism in the universe, as opposed to you in a black void. So it's pretty much the same thing that happened last time you didn't exist. It was just, it was followed by birth, but it would be followed by yet another onset of consciousness again, only somewhere else, and it would be something else. It wouldn't be a continuation of you. So, and it isn't supposed to be comforting, really. It's just, I'm stating this as a matter of fact. So it's not a personal continuity of your consciousness. It's just that there will be consciousness in the universe after you die, and because you no longer exist, and that is the only experience there is in this thought experiment, so that will be the experience that comes after your death, as opposed to you experiencing nothingness. So I hope that helps explain generic subjective continuity. So, look, we could do this in reverse. Say this one and only alien organism dies, and then you come to exist, and you're the only consciousness there is whatsoever. And so, you have to look at yourself as just another consciousness. Sam Harris recently said that we are identical to experience. You're not having an experience, you are experience. And so, wherever there's experience, if there's only one experience in the universe, whether it is the body that's watching this video right now or some other body, if there's only one experience in the universe, then that's the experience. That is going to be the experience, the one and only experience that's going on, as opposed to you being a black void. So, anyways, I hope this helped.
But there's something paradoxical about the very idea of death as a condition in which every individual life and mind terminates. And my purpose now is to explore that paradox. The philosopher Tom Clark has a wonderful essay, which you can read on his website, naturalism.org. And the essay is titled Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity. And I want to explore his argument here in some detail. Of course, other philosophers and scientists have said many things on this point. For instance, we have the famous quotation from Epicurus, as we encounter him in Lucretius's poem on the nature of things. Quote, "Death is nothing to us. When we exist, death is not. And when death exists, we are not. All sensation and consciousness ends with death, and therefore in death there is neither pleasure nor pain." End quote. So this idea of nothingness, of oblivion, of a dark abyss, of a kind of positive absence, of an endless deprivation of experience, is misleading if we're simply talking about the end of experience. You didn't experience your absence before you were born. And if death is truly the end of experience, you won't experience your absence after you die. So this reification of death as eternal nothingness is fundamentally misleading. And Clark starts his essay there. The philosopher Wittgenstein made a similar point in disparaging Freud's notion of the unconscious. He said, quote, "Imagine a language in which instead of saying, 'I found nobody in the room,' one said, 'I found Mr. Nobody in the room.' Imagine the philosophical problems that would arise out of such a convention." End quote. That's from the Blue Book. The point is, nothingness isn't something, and therefore it can't be a permanent condition of any being or mind. The second point that Clark explores is the subjective continuity of consciousness. From the point of view of consciousness, there can be no experience of before or after with respect to birth and death. So there is something almost eternal about it from its own point of view. Of course, we think we experience interruptions of consciousness while alive, in sleep or under anesthesia, but that's not quite true. It's true that we experience changes in the character of our experience, that is, in the contents of consciousness. It feels like something to wake up groggy from sleep, say. But from the point of view of consciousness, cessation is truly the absence of experience. Well, then it can't be experienced, and the continuum of conscious subjectivity will remain undivided from its own point of view. If, on the other hand, there is some qualitative character to these intervals of cessation, however subtle, well, then that is another instance of conscious experience, however subtle. In either case, from the point of view of consciousness, we just have one damn thing after the next, even when some of those things indicate that there must have been a preceding gap in the continuum. That is, we lost some hours to sleep, or to anesthesia, or some minutes or moments to some experience of cessation in meditation. In fact, it's not clear to me that consciousness isn't routinely interrupted, even in the normal course of events. This does have implications for how we think about the nothingness that bounds either side of our lives. As Clark points out, the time before your birth is not an abyss from which you managed to escape. And by the same token, the time after you die cannot be some sort of oblivion. From the point of view of consciousness, there is something eternal about its being what it is. In this moment, from your point of view, there was never a time at which you didn't exist, and there won't be a time at which your existence will end. Okay, so now I'm making the turn toward paradox proper. Let's just review where we are. We have the fact that we should not expect to experience oblivion after death, even if death is synonymous with the end of experience. And we have the fact that consciousness is always present for itself, that it is continuous even if we have good reason to think that it gets interrupted in the case of any specific person. There's one more fact to consider before things get genuinely strange. It's this further fact that consciousness is intrinsically impersonal, because it's merely the light by which anything that is personal is known. And this includes anything you can notice about yourself, your sensory experience, what you see and feel in this moment, or any specific memory or thought. Literally anything you can bring to mind or perceive in this or any other moment, your beliefs, your desires, anything you can notice about yourself that makes you specifically you and not some other person. All of these personal things are merely appearances in consciousness. Consciousness itself is utterly undefined. It's the impersonal condition in which everything else arises. So, recognizing this, Clarke suggests, quote, "Instead of anticipating nothingness at death, I propose that we should anticipate the subjective sense of always having been present, experienced within a different context, the context provided by those subjectivities which exist or come into being." It proposes a kind of Rip Van Winkle thought experiment. Imagine being put to sleep and then being awakened many years or even centuries later. It should be clear that experientially this isn't fundamentally different from what happens to you every night. You would still be you, experiencing the continuity of consciousness. It's just that your circumstance in the world would be very different. But now imagine that changes were made to you during the interval. How much would we have to change about you for us to say that your life ended and that a completely new person has been born? If the changes were minor, well then you would just be the same person waking up with just a few quirks. If the changes are sweeping, well then you would be quite different, but there still seems to be the subjective continuity from the point of view of consciousness. It's just that the contents of consciousness have changed. Your goals, your desires, your memories. Even though the memories of your old life might be gone, it does seem very strange to say that the interval of sleep is now some kind of permanent abyss that is a real death from the point of view of consciousness. Here's what Clarke writes, quote, "Although this transformation has disrupted the personal subjective continuity imparted by a stable context of memory and personality, there is another sort of continuity, or sameness, that's created by the shared sense of always having been present. Such generic subjective continuity is independent of the context of memory and personality, that is, of being a particular person, and it amounts simply to the fact that whoever wakes up feels as if they've always been here, that there's been no subjective blank or emptiness in front of their current experience. We can, I think, imagine going to sleep, being radically transformed, and having someone else wake up with no worry about falling into nothingness, even though we no longer exist." End quote. It seems to me that this effect is especially clear if we just skip the interval of sleep. Just imagine if we changed you moment by moment. If we changed each one of your memories and every other personal attribute, one at a time, every second, for the rest of the day. Let's say you don't currently like radishes, but in 14 minutes you will. Let's say you currently remember that you had cereal for breakfast today, but in about an hour you'll recall that you had eggs this morning. At what point in this process of change would we have to say that you had died, and that this new person's experience is no longer subjectively continuous with yours? Is there such a point? Why would there be? There's been no cessation of consciousness. It's just that the context of consciousness has gradually changed. Now, would death come any nearer to you if we started changing your cells? Perhaps by swapping in cells that harbor the DNA of another person? Imagine that consciousness is maintained through this process. Is there a point at which death is real? So sit with that for a second, and now we can leap to the truly strange inference. How are such manipulations any different than what happens when one person dies and another person is born? In this case, too, there's no end to experience from the point of view of consciousness for the first person, nor does the second person who's born experience a prior period of never having existed before. There's just the subjective continuity of consciousness, as and for itself, in either case. And it's intrinsically impersonal. Clarke writes, quote, "This thesis implies that even if all centers of awareness were extinguished, and the next conscious creature appeared millions of years hence, perhaps in a galaxy far, far away, there would still be no subjective interregnum. Subjectivity would jump that objective gap, just as easily as it jumps the gap from our last experience before sleep to the first upon awakening. All the boring eons that pass without the existence of a subject will be irrelevant for the subject that comes into being, nor will they count as nothingness for all the conscious entities which cease to exist. Subjectivity, awareness, consciousness, experience, whatever we call it, never stops arising as far as it is concerned, as though I give too much weight to the subjective sense of always having been present. And in claiming that subjectivity for itself always is, I ignore the vast times and spaces in which no consciousness exists at all. Nevertheless, I believe a materialist can see that consciousness, as a strictly physical phenomenon instantiated by the brain, creates a world subjectively immune to its own disappearance. It is the very finitude of a self-reflective cognitive system that bars it from witnessing its own beginning or ending, and hence prevents there being, for it, any condition other than existing. Its ending is only an event, and its non-existence a current fact for other perspectives. After death, we won't experience non-being. We won't, quote, fade to black. We continue as the generic subjectivity that always finds itself here, in the various contexts of awareness that the physical universe manages to create. So when I recommend that you look forward to the continuing sense of always having been here, construe that you not as a particular person, but as that condition of awareness, which although manifesting itself in finite subjectivities, nevertheless always finds itself present. End quote.
You sent me a video by this other guy who you said didn't get it. And it was interesting because he ended up saying, well, I don't really care about what other people experience. I want it to be my experience, which I think is very, very natural. But so he didn't quite seem to grasp the significance of it. Do you have any reactions to what he was saying?
Well, he missed the point. He didn't see that that it would be the I at that point in time, as opposed to the I that it is now. So it wasn't visceral for him. For me, it's very visceral. Like I can sit here and just imagine being a whale or being maybe an ant, or like I often say, a chicken in a factory farm. A lot of people seem to have difficulty understanding that one of those would be the experiences that follows this one, but they kind of hang on to themselves, and they're not able to I guess let go of themselves, objectively see themselves. I'm not exactly sure how to put that. That's why I was hoping you could help me with that.
Yeah, well, I think this is where the thought experiment I think really helps, because and Elijah Sam gets into this in his the second half of the podcast. He goes through the thought experiment pretty much, and to see that if you were changed bit by bit, you wouldn't have any sense of discontinuity, and you as a person would survive up until the point where you don't exist as the same person anymore, but yet someone would still be there. So if you go through the thought experiment, then you can see that there really there is a connection. There is this subjective continuity, and therefore the experience of the person that you're transformed into, that's what the thought experiment is about. This person is a potential object of concern for you, because you don't want to, whoever they are, you don't want them to suffer. And it also makes, I think what the thought experiment does first, though, is it makes it plausible that there's no nothingness, that whatever subjects coming into existence, either whether it's by the transformation in the thought experiment or by regular death and birth, never find themselves, have never been not present for themselves. So that's the first, I think the first thing is to sort of dispel the intuition of nothingness or oblivion. That's the primary point. And I think it's the thought experiment that is very useful in doing that. Mm-hmm. Were you able to follow that through, Elijah, that in the paper?
What exactly?
Well, in the paper, the death, nothingness, and subjectivity paper. I don't know if you've looked at it.
Yeah, I have. You mean your thought experiment with the brain surgeon?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that helps to make clear that there's a rather concrete sense in which, if you're not sure, when you wake up as yourself, there's been no discontinuity for you, because being asleep or under anesthesia doesn't exist for you as a subject. So there's continuity there. And then if you're changed enough so that it's not you, but someone else, there's still no discontinuity. And that, to me, is the important point to get across, because in effect, you've died as the result of this transformation. You as a person no longer exist. A new person is there, but there's been no nothingness out of which you've gone into and out of which this person comes. That's the idea. By the way, does that make sense? I mean,
well, to me, it does, definitely.
Yeah. So some people obviously don't get this and still are under the, which is quite natural, because there's no cessation of experience. It just continues in other forms, but you as a person don't get to experience that continuity. What there's no particular person that is continuous. It's just that subjectivity is never absent for itself in all these different forms. So Elijah, in Harris's podcast, he says, and this is an interesting way to express it, he says there's something eternal. There's a kind of eternality, eternal about consciousness. So that was interesting, a way to put it that way.
Something internal.
Eternal.
Eternal, okay.
Yeah, not internal, but eternal.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, timeless or transcending time. And Ted, you put this in a really nice way. You said it's kind of like a time machine.
Yes, unconsciousness is a proverbial time machine. Yeah.
I like that. He says there's nothing to look forward to. Well, I mean, he's kind of playing on this. Nothing to be frightened of.
On the contrary.
But and this brings up a point that Ted, you've emphasized, and I get at it a little bit in my paper, but you made a more definite point of it, which is that the fact that we don't have nothingness to look forward to is actually itself is a bit scary, because we can't look forward to oblivion.
Right.
It's not, and this is what you see, all those headstones with rest in peace on them. Now, what is that but looking forward to an experience of non-experience, where you get a respite from being conscious, right? You're resting there in a nice state of unconsciousness.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins recently said in a book review of Katie Englehart's book, The Inevitable, he said that death would be a transition to our peaceful oblivion. It sounds nice, but yeah.
Right. So it is something that you could possibly look forward to, and unfortunately, we can't. Which is kind of a drag, because, as Alan Watts puts it at the end of his lecture on death, he says there's no escape. There's no escape from subjectivity. The I always recreates itself in all these different places and times and types of sentience. And the fact that there's no escape from consciousness is, to me, I mean, that's actually a little hard to deal with if you're looking forward to nothingness.
Yeah, if you consider all the suffering wild animals go through, there's videos online of the things that happen in nature. So
yeah, even if you compare the numbers, it's like so much more likely to be a factory farm chicken somewhere in Russia than to be like a human being in the first world, for instance. Or even if you are a human being in the third world, where people are starving to death, they don't have clean water and all of that. That's not nice either. So it is quite scary. If I could choose, I probably would take eternal oblivion, but yeah, it's not really a choice, is it?
So gentlemen, do we want to then burden the world with
argument is, I understand people are in pain and they want to get out, and they understand that I can't be useful because I'm too distracted by my neuroses, or I'm too distracted by my poor health, or I'm too distracted by whatever, and so I can't make a contribution to the cause. I can't really fight the blobs. I got no swords and I got no arms and I'm crippled, and so I understand. I'm not telling people not to suicide. I'm just making the argument, if you think suicide means you've escaped, but you really haven't, because they'll replace you like that fast. Another consciousness is going to take your place. So all you've done is change where consciousness is. You haven't changed its existence any. And you're probably going to have a consciousness that's in worse shape than you were. I mean, it's going to be in a place you would yourself if you knew you were going there. You yourself even faster if you knew that was your fate. I mean, my fate is bad, but my fate is which one am I more afraid of, right? My future, getting debilitated, diseased, and dying, or the future that my replacement's going to exist in. So I'm just saying that's there's picture sizes you can view, the bigger the picture gets. And I'm just saying there's lots of little subtle arguments about resource consumption and all these kind of things that you can argue. But the fact is the biosphere as a whole is what you're really talking about. And, you're just playing a role in a biosphere, and the biosphere will replace you. And you'll do it quickly, so you're not going to be spared. You're not sparing conscious beings any grief like self. It really just doesn't work, because whatever you were going to consume, some new piece of biology is going to consume. The sun will still shine on it like a solar panel. it'll just stick a new solar panel in. Like the solar panel dies, well, all the other solar panels keep making solar panels. So they'll just fill in the blank where your solar panel was with another solar panel. Another victim is going to be put through the dream sequence of horse we live through. And it's probably, like I said, not going to be a better story. It's going to be even a worse story than your story. So you're causing the writing of a book that's even worse than the book you're burning, kind of thing. So again, I'm not talking about any kind of reincarnation, spiritually wise, or your exact consciousness, or any of this other. I'm just talking about the practical fact that every brain is doing this stuff of having a life experience and an adventure, and it really doesn't matter. I mean, as much as you think it matters that I'm special, look how curly my hair is, and I have a special super way. I'm a super caregiver, I'm a super love person, I'm a super hugger, I'm a super, they all think there's something. They're all living some sort of brain, and it really doesn't matter. I could change the characters, I can take Eeyore out and put in something called, Flim Flam, just make another character, it doesn't matter. I mean, they're really not integral. You could just you can replace the rabbit with a turtle, it doesn't matter. So, but again, it's nothing about reincarnation or anything, it's just the practical fact that the biosphere is going to make consciousnesses until we stop it, and it makes them based on resources. How much does it have the energy to do it? Does it have the carbon to build it out of? Does it have the steel? Does it have and that's all it is. It's just a model of resources. So until you poison that environment, sufficiently, make all of the little atomic bits unusable, break it down so there's no more replication, or there's no more stuff to to build the replications out of. It's you're doomed here. This is a terrible story of we're not winning until it's done, because personally there's no escape. I mean, yes, personally, if you're going to say personally from this little silly stories position, but there's a ton of, it just doesn't matter where the story is running and what story is running. It just matters that the projectors are running. It doesn't matter what the film is. It's probably, I'm not being perfectly eloquent in describing this, but that's a pretty good analogy. It's about projectors. Projectors are doing the pain and suffering thing. The movie's irrelevant. Okay, it's the projector doing the work of living and suffering and fighting and struggling. That's the part that sucks. And we don't escape that suck, because they always replace the projectors that jump out.
I'm going to read Tom Clark's views on David Benatar's anti-natalism and where we differ, our disagreement. I believe it appears that Tom is misunderstanding David Benatar's anti-natalism. I'll show you where as I read this. Tom says, I'm sympathetic to antinatalism, especially given a climate catastrophe, but of course would not endorse any taking of existing life. I don't think GSC makes it the case that it's useless to avoid bringing additional sentient beings into the world as a means to reduce suffering. Just because non-existence isn't a positive state of nothingness doesn't mean that suffering isn't avoided by having fewer sentient beings that could suffer. As for people anticipating nothingness at death, I quote a lot of instances of that at the beginning of the paper linked below, so don't think it's a straw man. The thought experiment in the paper, if you go through it carefully, should make clear that the intuition of impending oblivion at death isn't a real possibility, in which case, what should be anticipated? Here's a link to his essay. This part, he says, just because non-existence isn't a positive state doesn't mean that suffering isn't avoided by having fewer sentient beings that could suffer. See, this is where we kind of part ways, is because of GSC. Sure, suffering, that particular life won't suffer, but suffering isn't avoided, as I pointed out earlier in earlier chapters. Whether or not you're born doesn't stop life from coming after non-existence. So my not being born wouldn't stop some other life from being the life that comes after non-existence. And so that would result in suffering. So let me continue. I say, Tom, I agree that less people may have positive outcomes for the environment, and less people does equal less people suffering. However, this isn't my concern or the asymmetry argument's concern. Benatar wouldn't be happy if he understood GSC to mean that if it isn't one life, it's another. No escaping conscious experience. This is all the asymmetry argument is about. Benatar does talk about other types of antinatalism in his books, but the AA is the biggest one, and his main reason for being an antinatalist, and is the reason most people are antinatalists. So it really does come down to conscious subjective experience versus endless non-experience, which you and I know is not achievable. Here he says, I think antinatalists are saying the absence of suffering is better than its presence, and we can come to that conclusion by comparing an absence with a presence. The absence of a being that would have otherwise existed means an absence of suffering that would otherwise have been present. I'm not sure why this doesn't make sense. So yes, that particular context of suffering, or that particular instance of that unique suffering wouldn't have existed. But that doesn't mean that there is an absence of suffering. There's still suffering, but it would just be happening in the life that it would have been had you not been born. If it isn't one life, it's another. So suffering itself is not avoided. As Benatar points out, and I agree, all lives contain suffering. And that's Benatar's desire, is to negate suffering. And he prescribes not being born as the way to cancel out suffering, because he says all lives are suffering. So Tom is kind of stuck with the idea that Benatar is talking about individual lives. But as I pointed out in chapter 1, that's not the case. Benatar is talking about life itself as a whole, in general, kind of monolithically, as an enterprise. Just life versus no life. That's what it really is. You could, in a way, because he says that all lives are suffering and no lives are worth, it's always wrong to cause someone to exist, then we could, in a way, look at all life, each individual person, as the same person. It's just, okay, and each of them has, too much suffering going on in their life. We'll just say that each person has, in this scenario, in this thought experiment, all of them have the same amount of suffering. It's just a clone of each life. There's just billions of them, and each of their life is exactly the same. So it comes down to, okay, so if this person isn't born, then because if it is in one life, it's another, then it would have been one of the other lives, which is identical to that. But people will say, well, no lives are identical. Each individual, some lives are worse than others. Yes, that's true, but the fact that Benatar says no lives ought to be created, it turns it into, it kind of is doing away with the whole, he's kind of ignoring individual circumstances. Instead, he's looking at life as a whole. Individual lives, to be concerned about individual lives is not the concern of the asymmetry argument. That the concern of individual lives is a different argument for antinatalism. You're just looking at that individual and saying, well, you shouldn't have caused this person to be born because you have this disease and your husband has this disease, so you knew very well that this child would be born with a disease. That's not what the asymmetry argument is about. It's about just any generic life. Shouldn't have a life. You should not cause any birth because there's going to be suffering involved in this life. So that's the asymmetry argument, is that it's better to have no life. The concern for individuals, I don't even know what antinatalism that's called, but I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with the asymmetry argument, with the Benatar's desire to save non-existent people, to spare them from existing, from suffering.